I have a timely topic I'd like to discuss today, which is how can the European Union and other countries like Canada, New Zealand, Australia prevent big tech and also tech oligarchs from ransacking their democracy? So, a few different ideas to bring up here. First, we have wealth. This is probably one of the bigger drivers here of the problems that are happening in 2025 in the United States. And one great article I read recently talked about treating extreme wealth like you would treat, let's say, a rogue nation. So you have tariffs against extreme wealth. So if you look at maybe people who have $100 billion or more, could countries actually enact tariffs on those individuals so that they protect their nation's sovereignty? So I think that's really what we're seeing here is that European nations, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the Commonwealth, the UK, they have to think of extreme wealth and also big tech as a threat to their nation's sovereignty. And one of the ways to do this is to enact tariffs against the individuals that are really driving some of these policies from the United States. Another thing to think about is how do you prevent that extreme wealth from starting in the first place? And so, wealth tax is something that many nations are exploring. Spain has a good example of a progressive wealth tax. And if you're able to put a cap on this income, that can also limit one individual from effectively acting like a nation state and even trying to invade the sovereignty of other European nations. Another thing to consider here is social media. So, social media is playing a huge role in many of the undemocratic practices in the world, and partially because the algorithmic feed is pushing misinformation and disinformation from even regions that are trying to spread a narrative. And many people in the United States, unfortunately, lack basic critical thinking skills. And so that misinformation that's getting spread to them is effectively, a propaganda tool that has no parallel really in history. Maybe if you look at the French Revolution and you look at the pamphleteers, there was some of that going on, and actually it did lead to some of the things that happened in the French Revolution. For example, the fake stories about, the Queen, stealing a diamond necklace, etc. A lot of that misogynistic pamphleteer material, really, you can see its same footprint in social media today. So one of the ways that you could think about regulating it would be to tax the amount of misinformation. So if a platform has, unequivocally, 80% of the traffic as misinformation and disinformation, then maybe there's an 80% tax on the profit. So that could be one mechanism. Another one is that really thinking about limiting social media to people under 18. Like, could you effectively ban it and make sure that this is not a habit that people are forming? Also, to look at the ways that social media and big tech platforms have degraded journalism and degraded local businesses, and that could play a role as well. Let's also talk about the sensible regulation of big tech. I think that's another issue that we're seeing is that people in the EU are starting to get a little bit shocked when they look at America and go, wow, maybe these big tech companies are not our friends. What can we do to regulate them? And I think really the way to think about this is that you cannot be paranoid enough. What can you do to create these firewalls for your society against the Bay Area big tech scene, the Bay Area VC scene? Because the goal really is to take over a nation's sovereignty. And if you look at a lot of the stuff that's happening with big tech, if you're running their operating system, well, that data is going to get sent to an American corporation. If you look at some of the services like Uber, Airbnb, what's really happening? Well, they're making slaveware. So what slaveware is it's enslaving people to do gig work like, a TaskRabbit or, renting a property or, driving a car. And it's also putting that tax back to the American corporations. Instead, these European countries could regulate the effect of these negative externalities and stop all of the profit and all the taxation that's being put on their society by limiting the control of those services in their local region. And I think that's really one way to think about this is how can these different European Union conglomerates, how can Canada, how can New Zealand, how can Australia, how can the UK really think through ways to protect themselves from these predatory business practices. Also, if you look at the quality of the software that's being produced, for example, Microsoft Windows is most people who are experts would say it's a terrible operating system. It's cost money. It's spyware. It's sending data to OpenAI. And additionally, the features are not great. If you compare it to an open source version like Fedora or Ubuntu or some other Linux flavor, it's vastly superior because, first of all, it doesn't cost anything. Two, you can inspect the source code yourself, make changes to it. And so in many ways, a way to look at open source is it's a way to protect a nation's sovereignty. So I think if you're scared in the European Union, one of the ways that you could help your country fight back against some of the really authoritarian tendencies that are happening in the United States is to look at the strategy for open source. Can your nation adopt open source software, open source operating systems, also open source large language models? If you look at the commercial large language models, you'll see that there's misinformation that's being spread by tech people in the United States. For example, the founder of LinkedIn recently went into CNBC and said that the majority of businesses don't run on open source software. That's just a straight up lie. 90% of the infrastructure globally runs on Linux. If you look at the top 25 languages, something like 97% of the open source languages are the predominant in the top 25. Also databases, we can see that most of the databases that have been around are also open source. So there's essentially no precedence for commercial software being the predominant factor for technology. And then if you look at education, that's another one. You see OpenAI trying to come in and put their technology into education. So really, if you shrink this down, I think you can see that effectively big tech, the more you adopt big tech technology, big tech solutions, Bay Area technology solutions in the European Union, you're going to be putting yourself in a more vulnerable situation. It's possible that even you can see some of the ransacking of the government in the United States, where there's a Department of Government Efficiency or DOGE. You could see that scenario maybe is 2 years away from happening in the European Union or 3 years away from happening. So instead of just idly sitting by and watching what's happening with the U.S. and thinking you can't prevent it in the European Union, the way to prevent it would be to be proactive. And what is the root cause? If you did a 5 whys analysis, well, really there's an extreme imbalance with big tech, an extreme imbalance with the way people think in the Bay Area, where they're okay with extreme wealth, they're okay with monopolies. And if you look at what's happening, is it innovation or is it effectively a monopoly and oligarchy rule in the United States? And I think those are some of the ways that the European Union can fight back and say, one, the technology that comes from the United States is actually not that good. Two, open source is the only way to really control your nation's sovereignty. Three, social media itself is a vector for disinformation and misinformation, and there has to be extreme regulation around it, just like how in the French Revolution, the pamphleteers led to revolution. You cannot have misinformation and disinformation be the de facto way to communicate in your society. And then finally, these extreme wealth paradigms that you're seeing in the United States, where people who are worth $100 billion are effectively directly controlling the government and big tech controlling the government. You have to be proactive around it and have extreme countermeasures, including very aggressive wealth taxation, very aggressive tariffs against individuals and big tech companies. So those are a few of the ideas that I wanted to share with some of my friends in the European Union, in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK. I hope you take my advice because it's never too late to prepare for tomorrow.